A billionaire father watches silently from his car as a poor black girl gently feeds his disabled son at a park. The next day, his Rolls-Royce stops in front of her tiny apartment. And what happens next will melt your heart forever. It was a bright morning in New York, the city of glass towers, and endless movement. In the middle of it, a man named Edward Grant sat silently in the backseat of his car. He was a billionaire, the kind of man who could buy anything, but lately his heart had grown heavy. He had a son named Oliver, a gentle boy of 10, who had lost the ability to walk and speak after a terrible accident. 2 years ago, Edward had built hospitals, schools, and companies, yet he could not rebuild his son's smile. Every day, he saw Oliver sitting near the window of their mansion, watching other children play from afar. It broke him, but work had made him cold, distant, always searching for control. One afternoon, his driver stopped near a small community park. Edward had agreed to visit a local foundation that cared for children with special needs, a charity he funded, but never personally visited. He stepped out in his perfect suit, trying not to show emotion. His assistant whispered, "Sir, this is where they hold daily feeding and care sessions." Edward nodded, his expression blank, but his heart restless. At the center of the park sat a young black girl, no more than 16, feeding a little boy in a wheelchair, her hands gentle, her voice soft. She smiled every time the boy tried to move his fingers. Edward stood quietly watching something inside him stir. The boy in the chair was Oliver. He froze. He had not been told his son's nurse today was a volunteer from the community. His assistant whispered, "Sir, that girl's name is Amara. She comes here every day after school. She takes care of kids, even though she barely has enough to eat herself." Edward's lips parted slightly. He watched her wipe Oliver's mouth and whisper, "You are so strong, little one. One day, you will run again. You just wait." The billionaire's eyes softened, something he had not felt in years. Oliver looked up at her, trying to smile, and Amara laughed, saying, "That's it, that's the face I love. Look at you glowing today." She fed him slowly with patience, as if time itself had slowed down for her. Edward stepped closer quietly, but Amara did not see him. She was focused entirely on Oliver. Her world was that one small boy in front of her. When Oliver dropped his spoon, she caught it before it hit the ground, cleaned it gently, and whispered, "Accidents happen, little champion." Edward felt something rise inside him, guilt, admiration, maybe both. He realized this girl had given his son something he himself could not. Warmth. After the session ended, Amara stood up and adjusted her old worn backpack. She turned to Oliver, saying, "See you tomorrow, hero." He blinked twice, his way of saying yes. She laughed softly, then turned to leave. Edward finally spoke, saying, "Wait." She turned, startled, her eyes wide, seeing the billionaire standing behind her. She recognized him from the news and froze. "Sorry, sir, I didn't mean to be in the way." Edward shook his head slowly, saying, "No, you are doing more good than anyone else here. Tell me your name again." She said, "Amara, sir. I just come to help when I can." He asked, "Are you paid for this?" She shook her head, smiling, "No, sir. I just like helping people." For the first time in years, Edward smiled, faintly, saying, "Thank you for feeding my son." Amara's eyes widened. "Your son," she whispered, looking at Oliver again, her voice trembling. "I didn't know." Edward nodded, saying, "And yet you cared for him like family." She lowered her gaze shyly, saying, "Every child deserves love, sir, whether they are rich or poor." Edward looked at her in silence, knowing he had just heard something that would stay with him forever. He offered to drop her home, but she refused, politely saying, "Thank you, sir, but I can walk. It's not far." As she walked away, Edward watched her disappear into the crowd. His assistant whispered, "Sir, should I get her information?" Edward said quietly, "Yes, I want to know everything about that girl." Because something in his heart told him that meeting was not an accident. That night, Edward sat in his massive study, staring at the flickering city lights through the glass wall. He had closed $1 billion deal that morning, yet the only thing he could think about was the girl at the park, the way she had smiled at Oliver, the way his son's eyes had lit up for the first time in 2 years. He opened the folder his assistant had placed on the table. Inside were details about Amara, 16 years old, living with her grandmother in a small apartment on the city's edge. No parents, no money, her school grades excellent, but she worked evenings at a grocery store to survive. Edward exhaled softly, thinking, this girl gives more love with nothing than I give with everything. The next morning, he surprised his assistant, saying, "Cancel all my meetings. I'm going to the foundation again." His assistant blinked yes. Sir, at the park, the children were laughing. Amara was already there singing softly while helping two small kids draw pictures on the pavement. Oliver was smiling too, holding a crayon in his weak fingers. Edward walked up quietly. Amara looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning, sir. You came again." He nodded, saying, "I wanted to see how my son was doing and maybe learn something from you." She laughed a little, saying, "For me, sir." He nodded again, saying, "Yes, how to make someone happy with nothing but a smile." She blushed slightly, saying, "It's easy. You just treat people like they matter." Edward felt those words hit deep. He had spent years commanding people, not connecting with them. As the day went on, Edward sat beside Oliver for the first time in months, helping him draw. While Amara encouraged the boy, she said softly, "See, your dad's doing great. Maybe you'll teach him soon." Edward chuckled quietly, something no one in the park had ever seen. After the session, Amara helped pack up the supplies. Edward noticed her shoes were torn. He asked gently, "Do you always walk home?" She said, "Yes, sir, it's okay. I like the air." He said, "Can I give you a ride?" She hesitated, then smiled shyly. "Okay, sir." During the drive, she looked out the window, amazed by the tall buildings. She said, "I've never been this close to these towers. They look like stars touching the ground." Edward smiled softly, saying, "And yet you shine brighter than all of them." She laughed nervously, saying, "You're kind, sir, but I'm just someone trying to help kids like Oliver." He looked at her, saying, "And you're succeeding." When they reached her home, a small, worn-down building, Amara thanked him, saying, "Please tell Oliver I'll see him tomorrow." He nodded, then watched as she ran upstairs, waving from the balcony. Back in the car, Edward felt something shift deep inside. He told his driver, "I want to renovate that entire building." His driver asked for Amara. Sir Edward said yes, but quietly no one tells her yet. That night, he visited Oliver. Before sleep, the boy was awake, looking at a photo. Amara had given him a small drawing of the two of them holding hands under a rainbow. Edward sat beside him, whispering, "She's special, isn't she?" Oliver blinked twice for yes. Edward smiled for the first time in months, truly smiling. He said, "Good night, my little champion." In his heart, he knew that this girl had already begun changing both their lives, and tomorrow he would begin changing hers. The next morning, the sun was warm and golden over the city. Edward woke early, something he hadn't done in years. He told his staff he would take Oliver to the park himself. No drivers, no assistants, just him and his son. He wanted to feel what Amara had shown him, simple moments that money couldn't buy. At the park, Amara was already waiting. She waved excitedly as she saw Oliver's wheelchair rolling toward her. She said, "My hero is here. Look at that smile." Edward watched quietly how his son's face came alive around her. He could almost hear the laughter he had missed for so long. Amara began to teach Oliver how to move his hands in rhythm, clapping softly to a tune she made up. Edward knelt beside them, joining, and she laughed, saying, "Sir, you're not bad at this for a big businessman." He smiled, saying, "I've had a good teacher." When the session ended, she offered him a small homemade sandwich wrapped in paper. He hesitated, then took it. She said, "It's not much, but I made it for you and Oliver." He tasted it, and for a moment, it was as if he'd never eaten anything so real. She said, smiling, "Sometimes the smallest things fill the biggest hunger." Later, Edward followed her quietly back toward her neighborhood. He saw her stop to help an old woman cross the street, then hand her the last of the bread from her lunch bag. She didn't even think twice. She just did it. He stood frozen, realizing he had built empires, but never built a heart like hers. That evening, Edward called his foundation team and said, "I want to create a new scholarship fund for children like Amara." He didn't tell her yet. He wanted it to be a surprise. The next day, he invited her and her grandmother to the mansion, saying, "Oliver insists you both come for dinner." Amara's eyes went wide. The mansion looked like a castle. Her grandmother whispered, "We don't belong here, child." But Edward opened the door himself, smiling, saying, "Tonight you belong here more than anyone else." Inside the dining hall, Oliver sat at the head of the table, his chair decorated with balloons. He beamed. When Amara entered, she laughed, saying, "What's all this?" He tapped his small bell. Twice. She knew that meant happy. They all ate together, laughing, sharing stories. Amara told Oliver about her school, her dream of becoming a nurse one day. Edward listened deeply, for once not thinking about profit, but about purpose. After dinner, Oliver fell asleep in Amara's arms. Edward looked at her, saying, "You know, he sleeps peacefully only when you're near." She said softly, "Maybe, because I remind him that people still care." Edward felt tears in his eyes. He said, "And you remind me too." When they left, he walked them to the gate, saying, "Amara, I want to ask you something." She looked up curious. He said, "If I could help you study, would you let me?" She shook her head shyly, saying, "Sir, I can't take money from you. I didn't do this for reward." He said, "I know you didn't. That's why you deserve it." She smiled, saying, "Maybe one day, if I can earn it honestly, I'll come to you and ask for help." He said, "Then I'll be waiting." That night, Edward stood by his window, holding Oliver close. He whispered, "Thank you, my boy, because through her you gave me back my heart." Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Amara and the Grant family grew stronger. Edward found himself visiting the park every afternoon, not as a billionaire, but as a father, as a man who wanted to learn how to live again. He brought books, toys, and snacks for the kids, but he always watched Amara the way. She gave her time, her heart, her patience. She never asked for anything. One afternoon it began to rain heavily. The park emptied quickly, but Amara stayed, holding an umbrella over Oliver's wheelchair, protecting him from the cold. Edward arrived moments later, soaked from the rain. He said, "Amara, you should go home. You'll catch a fever." She shook her head, saying, "I can't leave him. He's scared of thunder. Look at his eyes." Edward knelt beside them, covering all three under his coat. For a long moment they sat together silent, just listening to the rain. Then Amara began humming softly, her voice trembling but warm. She said to Oliver, "It's okay, the sky is just singing louder today." He smiled faintly and closed his eyes in peace. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that moment, 3 lives under one small umbrella, bound by something no money could measure. He finally decided, tomorrow, I will change her life completely. The next morning, Amara didn't come to the park for the first time in months. Edward felt uneasy. He called the foundation. They said, "Sir, her grandmother fell sick, and she's been working extra hours at the store to pay for medicine." Edward stood up immediately and said, "Take me there." When he arrived at the small grocery store, Amara was behind the counter, her uniform damp, her eyes tired. But when she saw Oliver being wheeled in, she smiled instantly, as if nothing else mattered. She said, "My hero, you came to see me." Edward said quietly, "I think it's time you let someone help you for a change." She shook her head gently, saying, "Sir, I'm fine, really." Edward said, "Amara, listen, you've helped my son walk again, with hope. Now, let me help you walk into your future." He handed her a brown envelope. She hesitated, opening it. Inside was a scholarship letter from medical school, full tuition, paid with her name written at the top. Her hands trembled, tears welling up. She said, "Sir, I can't take this." Edward smiled, saying, "You already earned it long before I even offered." She whispered, "Why me?" He said, "Because you showed me what wealth really means: love, compassion, courage." Her grandmother came forward, crying softly, saying, "May God bless you, sir." Edward knelt beside her, saying, "Ma'am, you raised a diamond in a world full of gold." Amara hugged Oliver, gently saying, "Thank you for being my little angel." That night, Edward returned home, feeling lighter than ever. Oliver was asleep, clutching the drawing Amara had made him months ago. 2 hearts, one large, one small, joined together by a rainbow. Edward kissed his son's forehead, whispering, "She gave us both a second life." Months passed, and the city moved on. But for Edward and Oliver, life had changed forever. Oliver had grown stronger, his therapy improving faster than the doctors predicted. He was beginning to move his hands more clearly, and his smile was now a part of every morning. One sunny afternoon, Edward arrived at the Children's Hospital for a special event. The foundation he had started was opening a new wing for kids with disabilities, and he had chosen one person to lead it. As he stepped onto the stage, the crowd clapped, reporters' cameras flashing. He smiled, saying, "Today is not about me. It's about someone who taught me that the richest hearts are found in the humblest homes." Then he called out, "Please welcome Amara, the new head volunteer and scholarship ambassador." The crowd cheered as she walked up, wearing a simple white coat with her name embroidered. She looked at Oliver, who waved excitedly from the front row. She smiled and said softly to the microphone, "I used to be just a girl who wanted to help one child, and that one child helped me believe in miracles." She looked at Edward, tears glistening in her eyes, saying, "Thank you for giving me a chance to serve this world." He shook his head, saying, "No, thank you for saving my son and saving me." Later that evening, after the ceremony, they all sat together on the hospital lawn, Oliver laughing as he fed Amara a piece of cake. She said, smiling, "You're stronger now." He nodded, trying to form words. The doctor had said his speech was slowly returning, and for the first time, he whispered, "Thank you." Everyone froze. Edward covered his mouth with his hand, tears flowing. Amara hugged Oliver, saying, "You did it, hero. You really did it." Edward looked at her and said softly, "You gave him his voice back." She smiled, saying, "No, sir, love did that." The sunset painted the sky gold as they all sat together like a family. No fame, no fortune, just warmth and gratitude. Edward said to her, "Remember the day you fed him the park?" She nodded, "Yes, sir, I'll never forget." He said, "Neither will I, because that was the day a billionaire met the richest soul on earth." Amara laughed, saying, "Maybe now you believe money isn't everything." He said, "Now I know it never was." The camera slowly zooms out, the music swells, and the narrator's voice fills the air, saying, "Sometimes the smallest kindness can rewrite a life forever." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with the world. One click can spread kindness and hope to millions.